Hello everyone and welcome to another most interesting game from round 9 of the Tata Steel 2021 between Anish Giri and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. There was a lot of talk about this game yesterday as it features again none other than the Najdorf defense, and as you might have heard, Giri made some 20-hour long course with video material on the Najdorf defense. So Maxime is the one that's usually the expert on the Najdorf, but with Giri also being a great expert on the Najdorf, it's going to be very interesting to see how Giri will try to break through, or will Maxime finally be able to do something with the Najdorf, because Maxime already lost 2 games to the Najdorf, to Nils Grandelius and Fabiano Caruana, and now he will employ it again. So let's see what happens here. So Giri with the white pieces, as you might imagine, goes for e4. We have c5, the Sicilian defense, knight to f3, d6, and now again we will have the Najdorf setup. Captures, knight to f6, knight to c3, and a6. Here again Maxime goes for the Najdorf defense, and every video we mentioned, for those who are new to chess, that the most popular replies here are bishop e3, bishop g5, bishop e2, bishop c4, but pretty much any other move here is possible in the Najdorf setup. Like we've seen yesterday, Magnus played against Grandelius queen to d3, which is incredibly rare. There are but a few top-tier games in the database, and Magnus was able to get a win here. But Giri goes for h3. This is something that's called the Adams attack, and it's a very aggressive attempt to take down the Najdorf, preparing the very early g4, g5. But pretty much everyone prepares the early g4, g5 against the Najdorf. So what happens here? We have e5 by Maxime, chasing away the knight. Now you could retreat the knight to e2, to f3, even b3. Giri decides to go back to f3. We have bishop to e7, and now the immediate g4 as you have prepared it. And while you can try and prevent g5, Maxime even invites it with castles, and this is all perfectly fine. We have g5 chasing away that knight, and now there are 2 games in the database where knight to e8 was played, but here Maxime goes knight to h5, and it's as of move 9 that we have a completely new game. So let's see what happens here. Now Giri here goes for bishop to c4. Now of course Giri is an extremely well prepared gentleman, and he probably has this analyzed with some really strong engines, but bishop to c4 analyzed that, for example, at a depth of 30 doesn't really even show up. So bishop to c4 is definitely a tricky move, and it asks, does Maxime have anything prepared for this, because it's not like in the top 3 engine suggestions, or maybe it is if you have like a super powerful engine. So Maxime replies with bishop to e6. He would very much like to trade those bishops and increase his presence in the center with the pawns. Bishop back to b3, and now g6. Now freeing up the g7 square for the knight if you need to shift it, and just very strong blockade in the position. So here bishop to e3 by Giri, and knight to d7 now. We have queen to d2 preparing the castle queenside, and rook to c8. So very standard Najdorf moves. We have castles here, and here Maxime goes for knight to c5, and this is, we're gonna get back to this move, because here you either go b5 preparing knight to b6. For example, b5 you want to go to c6, and then you can shift the knight either to c4, or if white doesn't react, you will have additional support for maybe advancing the pawn to d5 and so on. But here Maxime goes for knight to c5, and he allows Giri to immediately eliminate that knight. And with the with this diagonal being closed, you don't really have much use of this bishop on e3. So this kind of even helps Giri. Bishop captures on c5, rook captures, and now h4, supporting that pawn on g5 once more, also getting away the h3 pawn from being a target to this bishop. We have knight to f4, and now the prophylactic king to b1. We have queen to a5. Maxime's pieces are coming closer and closer to Giri's king, and now knight to e1. This is a move you always want to look for. As we often say, the hardest move to find is with the knight back. He wants to remaneuver the knight to d3, and then put pressure on the rook and trade off this powerful knight, because this knight is extremely powerful. This knight on f3 is not doing anything. So that's usually a good advice when you want to find a move in the position. Look for your least active piece, and then try to make use of that piece. So knight to e1. We have rook f to c8, doubling up on the c file, and now knight to d3. We have knight captures on d3, king captures on queen captures on d3, and now comes a vintage Najdorf move, rook captures on c3. They say if you don't sacrifice the exchange on c3 in the Najdorf, are you even playing the Najdorf? No one actually says that, but you know what I mean. Everyone does this, especially Maxim. He always gives up this rook for knight here, and it gives for some very interesting plays. So b captures on c3, and now Maxim doesn't bother by capturing right away. He decides to continue in great style and pushes d5. So here you open up this diagonal for the bishop, and also if pawn captures, then this bishop can come to f5, grabbing hold of this diagonal, so it's going to be an extremely sharp game. Giri captures on d5, as now he has created a passed pawn, but he will have to endure some suffering for the moment. Bishop to f5, queen to d2, and now bishop to d6. For the moment, blocking the passed pawn. You do not want to meet this. And now c4. Giri cements that pawn on d5 and offers a queen trade. Maxim, of course, cannot afford to trade queens. He sacrificed material. So queen back to b6. And now we have king to a1, getting away from that b file. a5, a4 was the plan, so you might as well get the king to safety. We have a5 and now c3. We have a4 as planned, and now bishop back to c2, and now even e4. And now even e4. And now this diagonal opened up, and it's gonna be very interesting to see how Giri defends against this. And he finds a most devious move. He plays bishop captures on a4, and in such a crazy position to even consider a pawn grab is usually very dangerous. But here it works perfectly, because rook captures on c4. Now bishop goes back, bishop to b3, chases the rook away, and the rook to c5. Now, as the rook occupies the c file, bishop to e5 is coming, and Maxim will, of course, try and put pressure on this c3 pawn, which is now a very important defender to the king here. And now Giri finds an amazing defense. Rook h to e1. He wants to blockade this pawn with the rook and also help out with the defense along the third rank, because as long as this pawn is here and this bishop does not have a diagonal to use, that light square bishop will not be all that impressive. So here bishop to e5 as planned, and now rook to e3. What's much better than rook to c1, because this rook serves a double purpose, defends the pawn and also blocks the very important e4 pawn. So here queen to d6. Maxim decides to block the d5 pawn for the moment, because if you go for something aggressive like queen to a5, adding a third attacker here, for example, rook to c1, and now b5 with the idea of b4, taking advantage of this diagonal, then king to b1. And now if b4, you can simply capture, and you've solved all of your problems. So rook captures, king captures, and now queen a3 check, king b1, and you don't have a worry in the world. You're just going to push your pawn to victory. Like we said, as long as this diagonal is closed, there is nothing for white to worry about, unless you blunder mate or something like that. But okay, after rook e3, we have queen to d6. Maxim again has to waste a move to block this pawn, and now comes king to b2. And now not much left to do but continue attacking. b5. You of course prepare b4, so Giri prepares for that. And now rook to c8 with the idea of maybe putting some pressure on this a3 pawn. So Giri defends it preemptively. So rook to a1 and now b4. This was only a matter of time, because before this comes, as this pin still exists, we have a captures on b4, queen captures, making use of the pin, and now d6. And now a very sneaky idea, because of course if the bishop captures, then the queen can be captured. This pin no longer exists, and if queen captures, then you just trade queens, and you are very happy. You're up material, you're up the exchange, so you would have a very easy game. So after d6, we have rook to b8, now putting pressure on the bishop here, and now rook to a3. Very, very interesting defense by Giri, placing both of his rooks on the third rank, and now just asking, what do you do here? thought it was maybe the mailman I was mistaking. But okay, rook a3, defending, and then now comes queen back to b7. Interestingly, if you try to add a third attacker here with bishop to e6, you meet the very unpleasant d7. And now you cannot go any piece grabbing, because after bishop captures d8 queen with check, and this is now terrible because after king to g7 you don't have any discoveries, unfortunately, because of queen to f6 check. Crazy stuff. Point is, you want to eliminate the pinning piece, and now after bishop captures or anything, this comes with check. King captures, you just pick up the queen and you are very happy. So after rook to a3, queen back to b7, not allowing the queen to remain here. Now the bishop can move, can be traded, and so on. Also, you keep an eye on the d7 square. And now king to c1, unpinning. Now the bishop can move. Sorry, king to c1, not c2. Queen to d7. Again, Maxim has to blockade this passed pawn. And now queen to d5. So putting pressure on the f7 pawn. Now the queen will have to remain a defender here. We have bishop captures on d6, grabbing that pawn as the bishop was also under attack, and now rook to a6, attacking the bishop twice. The bishop, well, if you move the bishop, then white just trades queens. It's not a problem. So here, bishop rook to d8, but now it's move 40. Time control has been reached, but Giri has a very sneaky move to grab hold of the advantage. Feel free to pause the video and find the best idea for Giri while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on finding Giri's move. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's rook captures on d6, just giving up the exchange and going after this f7 pawn. Queen to d4 also is a possible move, but rook captures on d6 is much more forcing. So queen captures, we have queen captures on f7, king to h8, and queen to f6 check. So very forced. And Giri says here that he has a winning endgame, as he does have a passed c-pawn, and he's just going to push it up the board. So queen captures, we have g captures, and now rook to d6, going after the f6 pawn. But now another beautiful move by Giri, f3. This is incredibly impressive stuff, because now, of course, you cannot capture the pawn. If you capture it, rook to e8 is checkmate. The pawn covers the g7 square. So here, Maxim is forced to go for something else. We have rook captures on f6, f captures on e4. Giri now with the two passed pawns. And now bishop to e6, offering a trade of bishops. First, without wasting any time, Giri advances the pawn further. We have e5, rook to f1 with check, king to b2, and now king to b2, and now bishop captures on b3. King captures, and now king to g7. Maxim starts bringing the king into the game, and Giri now continues pushing his passed pawn. Rook to b1 check. We have king to a4, and now king to f7. The king now has to improve his activity. We have c5. Of course, you have to push the passed pawn. King e6, and now even c6. And this is, for those of you who are new to chess, a very important setup, well, sort of a relationship between the king and the pawns. When the pawns are placed like this, with one square in between them, they create a wall, and the white and the opponent's king cannot approach the other pawn. So now you don't want to, even if you could grab this pawn, most of the times if it's a king and pawn endgame, you cannot, because this pawn will advance. And with this setup, pawns creating a wall, you cannot go for either pawn. So here, rook to c1, going after the c6 pawn, king b5, just defending that pawn. Rook to c2, now comes rook to e1. Rook to c3, and now finally king to b6, preparing to further advance the pawn. Rook b3, we have king to a6, and now we have a few moves that repeat. King b6, rook b3 check, king to a6, rook a3 check, and now king to b7, probably with the idea of reaching time control, as with king to b7, Giri reached moves 60, and now is granted additional time, so he doesn't have to worry about time anymore. Maybe that was the case. I wasn't following the time at the moment, but it does seem to be reasonable, as it's a winning position and you don't want to mess up in time trouble. So rook b3 check, king to c8, and now rook to b4, but there isn't much you can do. c7, so what do you do now? Rook captures on h4, but even if you don't capture, there's not much for you to do. We have rook to c1, getting the rook behind the passed pawn, and now if you capture here, just king here, let's say check, king here, and next move you get a queen. So after this rook to c1, we have rook to f4, but it doesn't help. King to b7, we have rook to f7 pinning, and now rook to e1. Now Giri defends this pawn and is preparing king to b8 and just queening the pawn. And now all that's left for Maxim is to try and maybe push those pawns. He does have two connected pass pawns, so maybe he can give up the rook for the pawn and start pushing his own pass pawn. So king to b8, preparing to queen the pawn. Rook to f8 check, c8 queen, and now captures on c8. King captures on c8 and now h5. And now Maxim will one last attempt is to try and make something of those pass pawns, but now king to c7 by Giri. We have h4, king to c6, and it was in this position on move 70 that Maxim Vachier-Lagrave resigned the game, and a wonderful victory for Anish Giri, who crushed his own course basically, and made Maxim suffer yet another loss in playing the Najdorf. So this is Maxim's third loss in the Najdorf in this tournament, and it's just I don't think anyone got even a draw playing the Najdorf in this tournament. I could be wrong, but there were no wins with the Najdorf, so pretty crazy stuff. I guess everyone is extremely well prepared against the Najdorf, as you know, there's a lot of talk about the Najdorf these days. So here, for those of you who are new to chess, we're gonna play this out. Even though it seems that these pawns are very aggressive and fast, it's actually not a problem, because, for example, h3, king c5, the white king, even though very far away, he can actually catch those pawns. g4, you're gonna go king to d4, g3, king to e4. Now we're gonna play g3 or h3, doesn't even matter. White's next move is the same. So let's say h2, king to f3, and there is no queening the pawns because all of the squares are covered, and that's it. You're gonna have to play something. White will give up that, you're gonna pick up that pawn, and now of course king and rook against king, completely winning. So very interesting stuff. After king to c6, Maxim resigns, and now we are going to see the standings. Finally, these are the standings after round 9. As you can see, the leaders Anish Giri, Fabiano Caruana, and Alireza Firouzja with 6 out of 9. With 5.5, Sipenko Andre and Jordan Van Forest. Then with 5, Magnus Carlsen in 6th place. With 4.5, Harikrishna Pentala and Nils Grandelius. With 3.5, Jan Krzysztof Duda, Radoslav Wojtaszek, Arjan Tari, and David Anton Guijarro. And Maxim, who is having a terrible tournament with 3 out of 9, alongside Donchenko Alexander with 3 out of 9. So Maxim is in grave danger of dropping out of the world top 10 if he doesn't, really improve in these last few rounds. So we'll see what happens, and Alireza maybe even breaks through into the top 10. So will this be the year that Giri finally wins the Tata Steel, or will someone else be able to do it, or will Magnus be able now to maybe win all of the games until the end and, you know, just ruin everyone's plans? So a lot can still happen. We'll see what happens. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Always play the Najdorf. It's a great opening. I would like to thank Gerard Puyol Turo, Kamran Ansari, KS Dillon, Manja Remersval, and Joe Earp for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon. Continuing the coverage of the Tata Steel, checking up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.